The morning light filtered through the high windows of the National Armor Museum at Fort Benning, casting long shadows across the polished steel behemoths that stood silent witness to decades of American military history. Captain John Thunderbolt Reynolds adjusted his navy blue veteran's cap as he studied the newest addition to the museum's collection, a Soviet T-62 tank, its olive green hull bearing the scars of desert combat. "This beauty arrived last week," Reynolds said, his weathered hand running along the curved edge of the tank's distinctive hemispherical turret, one of the most revolutionary designs of the Cold War era. At 65, John Reynolds carried himself with the straight-backed discipline of his 30 years in the Army. His face, etched with lines of experience, had the leathery quality that came from years under desert suns and the burden of command decisions that sent men into harm's way. But it was his eyes that told the real story, piercing blue that missed nothing, yet carried a shadow of memories he rarely shared. The tour group of 20 civilians gathered around him, smartphones ready, faces eager for the insights only a man who had faced these steel monsters in combat could provide. "Now, what makes the T-62 special is this turret design," Reynolds continued, tapping the rounded dome. "Most Western tanks of the era used angular turrets with flat surfaces. The Soviets went with this hemispherical shape for a reason. Mathematically, a sphere has the highest ratio of volume to surface area of any three-dimensional shape. What that means in practical terms is that this design required the smallest mass of armor to cover a given internal volume." A teenage boy raised his hand. "But wouldn't flat armor be stronger?" Reynolds smiled, pleased by the question. "Good thinking, son. Flat armor at an angle can indeed provide better protection against certain types of rounds. But the Soviets weren't just thinking about protection, they were thinking about weight, internal space, and even protection against nuclear blast waves." As Reynolds explained the technical specifications, his mind drifted back to February 26, 1991, the now famous Battle of 73 Easting during Operation Desert Storm. He could almost hear the radio chatter, feel the rumble of his M1 Abrams as it crested the ridge to face a line of Iraqi T-62s and T-72s in the driving rain and swirling sand. "The turret was designed using two eccentric circles of different diameters," he continued, pulling himself back to the present. "This created progressive changes in armor thickness from front to back and from base to roof. Against armor-piercing rounds, it maintained consistent, effective protection while saving weight. The downside was inconsistent protection against heat warheads, which maintained the same penetration power regardless of impact angle." Reynolds paused, noticing a woman in her early 40s standing at the edge of the group. Unlike the others, she wasn't taking photos or making casual conversation. She was watching him with an intensity that seemed professional, analytical. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she held a small notebook rather than a smartphone. "Now, if you'll follow me to the engine compartment," Reynolds said, leading the group to the rear of the tank. The T-62 used a V-55V liquid-cooled diesel engine producing about 580 horsepower. Not as powerful as Western tanks of the era, but remember, the T-62 was considerably lighter, giving it decent mobility despite the weaker engine. As he described the tank's drivetrain and suspension system, Reynolds noticed the woman writing rapidly in her notebook. Something about her seemed familiar, though he couldn't place her. Perhaps she was military or a journalist. He'd given enough tours to recognize the difference between casual visitors and those with deeper interest. The T-62 could ford water obstacles up to 1.4 meters deep without preparation, he said. With the proper equipment, and it could snorkel through water up to 5 meters deep. Its top speed was about 50 kilometers per hour, but what mattered more was its operational range, up to 450 kilometers with external fuel drums. That kind of range meant Soviet tank units could march and fight for several days without refueling. Reynolds gestured for the group to follow him to the front of the vehicle, where the 115mm smoothbore gun jutted forward like an accusing finger. This was the T-62's true innovation, the first tank in the world to mount a smoothbore gun rather than a rifled barrel. The U-5TS gun could fire armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot rounds, APF-SDS, at much higher velocities than conventional ammunition. At the time of its introduction, it could penetrate any NATO tank at battlefield ranges. The woman had moved closer now, standing just behind the front row of visitors. Reynolds caught her eye briefly, and she gave a small, almost respectful nod. As the tour concluded and the visitors dispersed toward the museum's other exhibits, Reynolds checked his watch. It was nearly noon, time for his lunch break. He began walking toward the staff area when he heard footsteps behind him. "Captain Reynolds, do you have a moment?" He turned to find the woman from the tour extending her hand. "Lisa Mitchell, Horizon Documentaries. I've been hoping to catch one of your tours." Reynolds shook her hand, noting the firm grip. "Something I can help you with, Miss Mitchell." "I was hoping we could talk about Desert Storm," she said, specifically the 73 Easting engagement. Reynolds felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always came when the people asked about that day. Hundreds of journalists, historians, and military analysts had studied the battle that became known as the last great tank battle of the 20th century. It was taught at West Point and in military academies around the world as a textbook example of American armored warfare excellence. But they hadn't been there. They hadn't smelled the burning diesel, felt the concussion of tank rounds impacting steel, or heard the screams that sometimes still woke him at night. "There's plenty of official documentation on 73 Easting," he said, his voice cooling. "The Center for Military History has extensive records." Lisa Mitchell didn't retreat. "I'm not looking for the official version, Captain. I'm working on a documentary series about pivotal tank battles from the American perspective, and I need a technical advisor who was there. Someone who understands not just the mechanics of these machines, but what it was like to command them in combat." Reynolds glanced around the museum hall at the tourists taking selfies next to historical artifacts that represented life and death to men like him. "I appreciate the interest, Ms. Mitchell, but I'm not your man. Try the Veterans Association, plenty of tankers there who love to talk about the old days." He turned to leave, but her next words stopped him cold. "My father was Lieutenant David Mitchell. He served under you in Desert Storm. He always said you were the finest tank commander he ever knew." Reynolds turned slowly, studying her face anew. Now he could see it, the resemblance around the eyes, the determined set of the jaw. David Mitchell had been his gunner on a previous deployment before getting his commission and commanding his own tank during Desert Storm. "Dave was a good soldier," Reynolds said quietly. "How is he?" "He passed away 3 years ago, cancer." Reynolds nodded solemnly. Another name to add to the mental roster of brothers in arms gone too soon. "I'm sorry to hear that. Your father was a credit to the uniform." Lisa pulled a business card from her pocket. "If you change your mind about the documentary, please call me. It's important that we get this story right. Not just the tactics and technology, but the human element, what it was really like for the men inside these machines." Reynolds took the card reluctantly, tucking it into his shirt pocket without looking at it. "I'll think about it," he said, knowing he probably wouldn't. The past was best left buried, like the charred remains of Iraqi tanks in the desert sand. As he watched Lisa Mitchell walk away, Reynolds couldn't shake the feeling that something had been set in motion, something that would force him to confront the ghosts he'd been avoiding for over 30 years. Chapter 2. A Fateful Meeting. 3 days later, Reynolds sat in his modest apartment just outside Columbus, Georgia, nursing a glass of bourbon and staring at Lisa Mitchell's business card. The evening news played quietly on the television, but he wasn't listening. His mind was elsewhere, turning over the proposition and the unexpected connection to David Mitchell. The phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. The caller ID showed a familiar name, Michael Thompson. "Doc," Reynolds greeted, using the nickname that had stuck despite Thompson never having been a medic. "How's Fort Irwin treating you?" "Can't complain," Thompson replied, his voice carrying the easy confidence that had made him a natural as the senior trainer at the National Training Center. "Just finished smoking a bunch of lieutenants who thought they knew everything about tank warfare. Reminded me of our early days." Reynolds smiled despite himself. Michael "Doc" Thompson had been his driver during their first deployment together, before becoming a tank commander himself. Now he trained the next generation of armored warriors in the California desert. "Listen, Thunder," Thompson continued, using Reynolds' old call sign. "I got a call from some documentary producer today." "Lisa Mitchell?" Reynolds set down his glass. "She found you too, huh?" "She's persistent, I'll give her that. Said she already spoke to you." "Briefly," Reynolds admitted. "She's Dave Mitchell's daughter." There was a moment of silence on the line. "No kidding, little Lisa? I remember Dave showing us pictures of her at her high school graduation. She's not so little anymore. She wants to do a documentary about tank battles, specifically 73 Easting." Thompson's tone grew serious. "You gonna do it?" "I haven't decided. You?" "I told her I would if you did." Thompson paused. "It's been 30 years, Thunder. Maybe it's time to tell our story before there's nobody left to tell it. Reynolds stared at the amber liquid in his glass, watching it catch the light. Some stories are better left untold, Doc. This about Wilson? The name hung in the air between them. Marcus Wilson Sr. had been Reynolds' loader, a young sergeant from Detroit with a wife and infant son back home. He hadn't made it back from their final mission. Among other things, Reynolds said finally. Look, Thompson said, I'm flying east next weekend for my nephew's wedding in Atlanta. Why don't we meet up? Talk it through? If we both agree it's a bad idea, we'll tell Mitchell's daughter together. Reynolds agreed, and after they hung up, he found himself pulling out an old photo album from the bookshelf. Inside were fading photographs of young men in desert camouflage, standing proudly beside their tanks. Their faces looked impossibly young to him now, boys playing with the deadliest toys in the world, unaware of how the experience would mark them forever. He found the photo he was looking for, his tank crew from 1991. Reynolds standing tall in the center, Thompson to his left, David Mitchell kneeling in front, and Marcus Wilson Sr. grinning widely on the right, his arm thrown casually around Mitchell's shoulders. On the turret of their M1 Abrams was painted the name Thunderbolt, in the tactical marking of the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. A week later, Reynolds and Thompson sat at a corner table in a steakhouse in Columbus, two old warriors surrounded by civilians who had no idea of the history they shared. So, Thompson said after they had ordered, you gonna call her back? Reynolds sighed. I'm still not convinced it's a good idea. Opening old wounds, dredging up the past. Maybe it's not about the past, Thompson suggested. Maybe it's about the future. Making sure people understand what it was really like, not just the sanitized history book version. Before Reynolds could respond, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from an unknown number. Captain Reynolds, this is Lisa Mitchell. I'm in Columbus for research at the Infantry Museum. Would you be available to meet tomorrow? I have someone I'd like you to meet. Reynolds showed the message to Thompson, who raised an eyebrow. Persistent, he repeated. Reynolds typed a brief reply agreeing to meet at the museum the next morning, then put his phone away. If I do this, he said slowly, it's on my terms. No sensationalizing, no Hollywood dramatics. Just the truth about the machines, the tactics, and the men who fought. Thompson nodded. I'm with you, but remember, the truth isn't always simple. The next morning, Reynolds arrived at the Infantry Museum 15 minutes early, a habit from decades of military punctuality. He found Lisa Mitchell waiting in the lobby, accompanied by a young man in his early 30s, tall and lean with dark skin and a serious expression. Captain Reynolds, Lisa greeted him. Thank you for meeting us. This is my assistant, Marcus Wilson. Reynolds felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath him. The young man extended his hand, and Reynolds shook it automatically, his mind racing. The resemblance was unmistakable now that he knew to look for it. The same determined jaw, the same intense eyes as the man who had loaded shells into the breech of Reynolds' tank 3 decades ago. Marcus Wilson, Jr., the young man clarified, his expression giving away nothing. My father served under your command in Desert Storm. Reynolds found his voice. I remember your father well. He was an excellent soldier. So I've been told, Marcus said coolly, though I never had the chance to know him myself. The implication hung in the air between them. Marcus Wilson Sr. had died when his son was only an infant, and Reynolds had been his commanding officer. Lisa, seemingly oblivious to the tension, gestured toward the museum cafe. Shall we discuss the project over coffee? I've prepared some preliminary materials I'd like to show you. Reynolds followed them mechanically, his mind spinning. This wasn't just about a documentary anymore. This was about facing a responsibility he had carried for 30 years. The death of a man under his command and the fatherless child left behind. Over the next hour, Lisa outlined her vision for the documentary series. Steel Titans, the evolution of American armored warfare. It would cover the development of American tank doctrine through pivotal battles, with a special focus on the human experience of tank warfare. The centerpiece would be the Gulf War episode, she explained, sliding a treatment across the table. Specifically, 73 Easting and the encounters with Soviet-built tanks like the T-62 and T-72. We want to explore the technical aspects, how American tanks outclassed their Soviet counterparts, but also the experience of the crews who fought that battle. Reynolds glanced through the treatment, impressed despite himself, by the technical accuracy and attention to detail. This wasn't some Hollywood exploitation. Lisa Mitchell had done her homework. You've researched this well, he acknowledged. But what exactly do you want from me? 2 things, Lisa said. First, your expertise as a technical advisor to ensure we get the details right. Second, your personal account as a tank commander who faced these Soviet machines in combat. Throughout the conversation, Marcus had remained largely silent, observing Reynolds with an intensity that made it clear he had his own agenda. "And what's your role in this, Mr. Wilson?" Reynolds asked directly. "I'm a filmmaker," Marcus replied. "Documentary cinematography. I'll be shooting the technical demonstrations and interviews." Reynolds nodded slowly, weighing his options. The professional in him appreciated the thoroughness of Lisa's research. The veteran in him recognized the importance of an accurate historical record, but the man in him dreaded reopening the wound that was the death of Marcus Wilson Sr. "I need to think about this," he said finally. "It's not just my story to tell." Lisa seemed prepared for this response. "Of course, but I should mention, we're planning to film a segment at the National Training Center at Fort Irwin next month. Michael Thompson has already agreed to help us arrange access to demonstrate how modern tank training compares to the conditions you faced in Desert Storm." Reynolds shot her a sharp look. "You're good at this, aren't you? Setting up the pieces." Lisa met his gaze steadily. "I'm committed to telling an important story that hasn't been fully told. My father always said there was more to what happened at 73 Easting than made it into the official reports." "Your father talked about that?" Reynolds asked, surprised. David Mitchell had always seemed as reluctant as he was to discuss certain aspects of their service. "Not the details," Lisa admitted, "but he said if anyone could tell the real story, it would be you." Reynolds felt the weight of obligations settling on his shoulders. He owed it to David Mitchell, to the men who had served under him, perhaps even to the young man sitting across from him whose father had never come home. "I'll do it," he said finally, "but on one condition. This stays focused on the tanks, the tactics, and the officially documented battles. Nothing speculative, nothing sensationalized." Marcus Wilson Jr. spoke up for the first time in several minutes. "Even if that means leaving out important parts of the story?" Reynolds met the younger man's gaze directly. "Some parts of the story aren't mine to tell. If they involve my father, I have a right to know," Marcus insisted, a hint of challenge in his voice. Lisa intervened smoothly. "We're all interested in the truth, Captain Reynolds, within the bounds of what you're comfortable sharing, of course." Reynolds didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied Marcus Wilson's face, seeing in it not just the father he had known, but the questions of a son who had grown up with a void where a parent should have been. "We'll start with the technical aspects," Reynolds conceded. "The rest, we'll see." 2 weeks later, Reynolds found himself at Fort Benning's tank training grounds, where the museum had arranged for a restored M1 Abrams to be used for filming demonstration footage. The morning air was cool, but Reynolds knew from experience that inside the tank, temperatures would soon become stifling as the metal hull absorbed the Georgia sun. Lisa directed a small crew setting up cameras, while Marcus calibrated equipment with professional efficiency. Reynolds stood off to the side, watching the preparations with a mixture of nostalgia and apprehension. "We'll start with some basic operating footage," Lisa explained, approaching him with a clipboard. "Then we'd like you to walk through the interior, explaining the crew positions and functions." Reynolds nodded. "I assume you've been briefed on safety protocols around the vehicle." "Full briefing yesterday," she confirmed. "Marcus has military-embedded filmmaker certification from his work in Afghanistan." Reynolds raised an eyebrow, reassessing the younger man. "You were in Afghanistan?" "3 tours," Marcus replied without elaboration, focusing on his camera settings. Before Reynolds could probe further, a military transport arrived, and he was surprised to see Michael Thompson descending from the passenger seat. "Doc," Reynolds greeted him. "Thought you weren't coming east until next week." Thompson grinned, clasping his old commander's hand. "Changed my plans when I heard we were firing up an Abrams. Couldn't let you have all the fun." The reunion of the two veterans lightened the mood considerably. As filming began, Reynolds found himself slipping back into the role of instructor, explaining the features of the Abrams with the fluency that came from years of intimate knowledge. The M1 Abrams represented a quantum leap in American tank design, he explained for the camera. The combination of gas turbine engine, advanced composite armor, and digital fire control systems gave us capabilities the Soviets couldn't match with their T-62s and T-72s. Thompson added his own insights, and together they demonstrated the crew positions: commander, gunner, loader, and driver. Reynolds couldn't help noticing how Marcus focused his camera work whenever the loader's position was discussed, his professional demeanor occasionally slipping to reveal personal interest. After a lunch break, Lisa proposed a more dynamic demonstration. "We'd like to film the tank in motion," and if possible, a simulated firing sequence using the training systems. Reynolds exchanged a look with Thompson. Been a while since we took one of these for a spin. Like riding a bike, Thompson assured him with a grin. A 60-ton bike that guzzles jet fuel. With permission from the base commander, they prepared for the mobility demonstration. Reynolds would command, Thompson would drive, and two current service members would fill the gunner and loader positions. As they prepared to mount up, Reynolds noticed Marcus adjusting a camera setup on the turret. "That's secure," Reynolds asked, professional concern overriding the personal tension between them. "Triple checked," Marcus assured him. "I've mounted cameras on helicopters in Afghanistan. This is stable by comparison." Reynolds nodded, then made a decision. "You want to ride inside for a few minutes? Get some interior footage during operation?" Surprise flashed across Marcus's face, quickly replaced by professional interest. "That would be invaluable footage. Yes, if it's permitted." "You'll take the loader's position temporarily," Reynolds said. "Our regular loader can show you how to secure yourself properly." As they climbed aboard the massive vehicle, Reynolds felt a familiar calm settling over him, the focus that came with commanding a tank. He settled into the commander's station, checking the communications system and scanning the perimeter through his vision blocks. "Crew report," he called, following the protocol ingrained by decades of practice. "Driver ready?" Thompson responded. "Gunner ready?" came the voice of the young sergeant assigned to that position. There was a pause before Marcus's voice came through the intercom. "Loader, ready." Reynolds felt a chill at the echo of a voice from the past. "Driver, start engine." The Abrams roared to life, its gas turbine engine spooling up with a distinctive whine that rose to a powerful rumble. The vibration coursed through the hull, a sensation that transported Reynolds back to the Saudi desert in 1991. "Driver, move out. Standard course, easy pace." The massive tank began to roll forward, its sophisticated suspension absorbing the uneven terrain. Inside the turret, Marcus was filming the operation of the various systems, his professional focus momentarily overriding any personal agenda. They had completed about half of the demonstration course when an alarm suddenly blared through the intercom. "Fire warning," the gunner called out. "Engine compartment." Reynolds' training kicked in instantly. "Driver, shut down. Crew, prepare to evacuate." Thompson brought the tank to a halt and killed the engine. Reynolds quickly assessed the situation through his instruments. "Possible fuel leak. Everyone out. Standard evacuation procedure." The crew moved with practiced efficiency, even Marcus following the emergency protocols he had been briefed on. As they assembled at the designated safe distance, Reynolds could see thin wisps of smoke emanating from the engine compartment. Base emergency services were already responding, fire trucks approaching with lights flashing. Reynolds did a quick head count, confirming all crew members were safely clear of the vehicle. "Everyone okay?" he asked. The professional crew members nodded, but Reynolds noticed Marcus looking pale, his camera hanging forgotten at his side. "First time in an emergency evacuation?" Reynolds asked him. Marcus nodded. "Different when you're inside versus filming from outside." Reynolds understood completely. "You handled it well, followed procedures correctly." The base fire crew approached the tank, and the crew chief called out to Reynolds, "Captain, can you confirm what we're dealing with?" Reynolds stepped forward. "Possible fuel line rupture in the engine compartment. We had warning indicators but no visible flames before evacuation." As the firefighters moved to secure the vehicle, Lisa approached, concern evident on her face. "Is everyone all right?" "We're fine," Reynolds assured her. "Standard precautionary evacuation. These machines are complex. Maintenance issues happen." The tension of the moment seemed to have temporarily bridged the gap between Reynolds and Marcus. As they watched the firefighters work, Marcus asked quietly, "Is this what it was like in Desert Storm?" Reynolds considered the question carefully. "This was routine. Combat is different. In battle, you don't have the luxury of a safe evacuation. The mission comes first, even when systems are failing." Marcus nodded, seemingly absorbing this insight into his father's world. "Your father was exceptional under pressure," Reynolds offered unexpectedly. "Never saw him rattled, even when things went sideways." Marcus looked at him sharply, studying his face as if searching for insincerity. Finding none, he simply said, "Thank you for telling me that." The fire chief approached them. "Just a minor fuel line leak, nothing serious. The warning systems caught it early. Vehicle will need maintenance before it's operational again." Lisa sighed. "I guess that's the end of today's filming." "Not necessarily," Reynolds said, surprising himself with his willingness to continue. "We can still do the technical walkthroughs and interviews. Sometimes the reality of mechanical issues is part of the story too." Thompson clapped him on the shoulder. Now you're thinking like a real documentary advisor. As they regrouped to plan the remainder of the day's filming, Reynolds found himself watching Marcus, who had returned to his professional demeanor but seemed somehow changed by the shared experience. The brief emergency had created an unexpected connection, a glimpse of understanding between a tank commander and the son of the man who had once served under him. Reynolds wondered if this documentary project might prove to be more significant than he had initially thought. Not just a technical history of tank warfare, but perhaps a chance to bridge gaps between past and present, between those who fought and those who needed to understand why. Chapter 3. Facing the Past. The production team established a temporary base at Fort Benning, converting a classroom into an interview studio where Reynolds and Thompson would provide commentary on historical tank battles. The walls were adorned with maps, technical diagrams, and photographs of various tanks from the American arsenal. Reynolds sat beneath carefully positioned lighting, a microphone clipped to his collar, as Lisa prepared to begin the first formal interview session. "We'll start with your background," she explained. "How you came to be a tank commander, your training, that sort of thing. Then we'll move into the technical comparisons between American and Soviet tank designs." Reynolds nodded, adjusting uncomfortably in his seat. Despite decades of military briefings, he had never enjoyed being the center of attention. "Just speak naturally," Lisa advised. "If you need to pause or restart an answer, that's fine. We'll edit it together later." Marcus stood behind the camera, his expression unreadable as he made final adjustments to the equipment. "Ready when you are," he said, his voice professional but cool. Lisa positioned herself beside the camera. "Captain Reynolds, could you start by telling us about your military background and how you came to specialize in armored warfare?" Reynolds took a breath, focusing on the technical aspects of his career. "I enlisted in 1975 just as the Army was transitioning from Vietnam-era doctrine to preparing for potential conflict with the Warsaw Pact in Europe. I was assigned to armor based on my mechanical aptitude scores, trained on M60 Pattons initially, then transitioned to the M1 Abrams when it entered service in the early 1980s. He described the progression of his career from driver to gunner to tank commander, eventually commanding a platoon of 4 tanks. Throughout the narrative, he kept to the facts, avoiding the personal aspects of military service. "The M1 Abrams was revolutionary," he explained, warming to the technical subject. "Its combination of Chaubayam composite armor, gas turbine engine, and sophisticated fire control system made it the most advanced tank in the world when it entered service." "How did it compare specifically to the Soviet T-62 we've been examining?" Lisa prompted. "The T-62 represented a different philosophy of tank design," Reynolds explained, slipping into instructor mode. "Soviet doctrine emphasized mass production, numerical superiority, and simplicity of operation. They built tanks that conscripts could operate effectively with minimal training. American doctrine focused on technological superiority, better protection, better sensors, better fire control." The interview continued in this vein, with Reynolds providing detailed comparisons of armor thickness, gun performance, and mobility characteristics. He was in his element discussing the technical aspects, and even Marcus seemed engaged by the depth of his knowledge. After a short break, Lisa steered the conversation toward combat experience. "Let's talk about Desert Storm," she said. "Specifically, what it was like to face Soviet-designed tanks on the battlefield." Reynolds tensed slightly, but maintained his composure. The Iraqi army was equipped primarily with T-55s, T-62s, and some T-72s, all Soviet designs. On paper, the T-72 could have been a formidable opponent, but Iraqi crews lacked training, and their ammunition was inferior to what the Soviets would have used. "The Battle of 73 Easting has been called the last great tank battle of the 20th century, Lisa prompted. "Can you walk us through your experience?" Reynolds paused, choosing his words carefully. "The conditions were challenging, driving rain, poor visibility. We were conducting a movement to contact, essentially advancing until we encountered enemy forces. And at approximately 4:18 p.m. on February 26th, my troop crested a small rise and encountered elements of the Iraqi Republican Guard's Tawakalna division." He described the battle in tactical terms, how American thermal sights allowed them to see through the rain and dust, how the superior range and accuracy of the Abrams 120mm gun let them engage Iraqi tanks before the T-72s could effectively return fire. "We destroyed the first echelon of Iraqi forces and continued to advance," Reynolds said. The battle lasted just under an hour, but in that time, the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment destroyed approximately 85 tanks, 40 armored personnel carriers, and 30 trucks. With no American tanks lost, Lisa added. Reynolds nodded. We had the technological advantage, but more importantly, we had superior training, tactics, and leadership at every level. Throughout this portion of the interview, Reynolds noticed Marcus becoming increasingly tense behind the camera. The young man's jaw was clenched, his focus intense. I'd like to shift to something more specific, Lisa said, consulting her notes. You mentioned the technological advantages of American tanks, particularly the fire control systems. Could you explain how that translated to combat effectiveness against the T-62? Reynolds was about to answer when Marcus abruptly stepped away from the camera. I need 5 minutes, he said curtly, setting down his equipment and walking out of the room. Lisa looked startled. I'm sorry about that, Captain. Let's take a break. Reynolds nodded, removing his microphone. Is he all right? I think, Lisa hesitated. This might be more difficult for him than he anticipated. Hearing about the battle where his father died, Reynolds frowned. 73 Easting wasn't where Marcus Wilson Sr. died. Lisa looked confused. It wasn't, but I thought... No, Reynolds said firmly. Sergeant Wilson survived 73 Easting uninjured. He died 3 days later, on March 1st. Lisa's expression shifted to one of surprise, then realization. He died in a different engagement? I didn't know that. I don't think Marcus does either. Reynolds felt a cold knot forming in his stomach. What exactly did you tell him about his father's death? Only what was in the official notification, that Sergeant Wilson died heroically in Desert Storm. There weren't many details provided to the family. Lisa studied Reynolds' face. Is there something I should know? You should talk to him, Reynolds said, standing up. Find out what he knows, what he wants to know. This isn't just about a documentary for him. Reynolds left the room, needing air and space to think. He found himself walking toward the museum, drawn to the silent tanks that represented both technological achievement and the human cost of war. Inside, he stood before the T-62 again, studying its curved turret and sloped hull. The technical aspects were comfortable territory, measurable, definable, free from the messy complexity of human emotion and moral ambiguity. Captain Reynolds. He turned to find Marcus standing a few paces away, his expression guarded but determined. Mr. Wilson, Reynolds acknowledged. Lisa said my father didn't die at 73 Easting. Reynolds nodded. That's correct. Then how did he die? Marcus asked, his voice level but intense. The Army never gave my mother details. Just that he died in combat, serving with honor. Reynolds studied the young man before him, seeing both the boy who had lost a father and the man seeking closure. It was a separate operation, Reynolds said carefully, after the main combat phase. What kind of operation? Reynolds hesitated. Classified at the time. Marcus's expression hardened. That was 30 years ago, Captain. The war's been over for decades. Some things remain sensitive, Reynolds replied. Not everything that happened in theater was documented in the official history. He was my father, Marcus said, his voice rising slightly. I have a right to know how he died. Reynolds felt the weight of his responsibility, not just to the memory of Marcus Wilson Sr., but to the young man standing before him, shaped by an absence he had no control over. I'll tell you what I can, Reynolds said finally, but not here, not now, after we're done with today's filming. Marcus studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I'll hold you to that, Captain. They returned to the interview room separately, both men carrying the tension of unresolved history between them. The remainder of the day's filming proceeded professionally but with an undercurrent of anticipation. Reynolds provided detailed analysis of tank tactics and technology, drawing on his extensive knowledge and experience. Thompson joined for several segments, adding his perspective as both a former tank crew member and current trainer. By late afternoon, Lisa called a wrap on the day's filming, satisfied with the material they had captured. As the crew packed up equipment, Reynolds approached her. I need to speak with Marcus privately, he said, about his father. Lisa nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Take the conference room down the hall. I'll make sure you're not disturbed. Reynolds found Marcus checking footage on a laptop. Mr. Wilson, if you're ready, I believe we have a conversation to finish. Marcus closed his laptop and followed Reynolds to the conference room, a simple space with a table, chairs, and a window overlooking the parade ground. Reynolds closed the door behind them and gestured for Marcus to sit. Before I tell you about your father, Reynolds began, I need to understand what you're looking for. Is it closure, details of how he died, or something else? Marcus considered the question. My entire life, my father has been this heroic figure I never knew. A shadow, a photograph, metal in a box. I don't even remember him. I was only 6 months old when he died. And now, Reynolds prompted, now I want the truth. Not the sanitized version the Army gave my mother, or the story she told to comfort a growing boy. The actual events. Reynolds nodded, respecting the directness. The truth is rarely simple, especially in war. Your father was indeed a hero, one of the finest soldiers I ever commanded. But the circumstances of his death were complicated. Complicated how? Reynolds took a breath, organizing his thoughts. After 73 Easting and the official cessation of hostilities, our unit received intelligence about a modified T-62 tank that the Iraqis had been testing, one with advanced Soviet technology that we wanted to examine. Marcus leaned forward, intent on every word. We were tasked with a special mission, codenamed Dawn Runner, to locate and secure this tank for technical intelligence purposes. Your father was part of my crew for this operation. This wasn't in any of the official histories of the war, Marcus noted. No, Reynolds agreed. It wouldn't be. The mission occurred after the ceasefire in a gray area of operations that was politically sensitive. What happened? We located the modified T-62 at a Republican Guard facility near Basra. The area was supposed to be clear of enemy forces, according to our intelligence. It wasn't. Reynolds paused, the memory still vivid after 3 decades. We came under fire from a unit that either didn't get the ceasefire order or chose to ignore it. Marcus remained silent, waiting for him to continue. In the ensuing engagement, our tank was hit. Not critically, but enough to damage the fire control system. We were attempting to withdraw when we came across a group of civilian vehicles caught in the crossfire. Reynolds' expression grew distant. Your father spotted children in one of the vehicles. Without hesitation, he left the protection of our tank to help them reach cover. He was killed trying to save civilians, Marcus said, realization dawning in his voice. Yes, Reynolds confirmed. He managed to get 2 children to safety before an Iraqi RPG team targeted him. I ordered him to return to the tank, but Reynolds trailed off, the weight of command decisions made decades ago still heavy on his shoulders. He didn't, Marcus finished. He made a choice, Reynolds said quietly. A human choice in an inhuman situation. That's who your father was. Someone who couldn't ignore civilians in danger, even at risk to himself. Marcus absorbed this information in silence, his expression a complex mix of pride, grief, and lingering questions. Why wasn't this included in the official report? He asked finally. Because the mission itself was classified, Reynolds explained, and because the ceasefire had technically already been in effect. The engagement shouldn't have happened at all, according to the political narrative of a clean, successful war. So they sanitized it, Marcus said, a hint of bitterness in his voice, turned it into a generic died-in-combat story. The Army acknowledged his heroism, Reynolds pointed out. The Bronze Star with Valor device was for his actions that day. But they erased the context, the civilians he saved, the mission that shouldn't have been happening. Reynolds couldn't argue with that assessment. War is messy, Mr. Wilson. It doesn't fit neatly into press releases or history books. Marcus stood and walked to the window, looking out at the parade ground where new soldiers marched in formation. I've spent my adult life trying to understand what happened to my father. That's why I became a documentary filmmaker, to find truth in complicated situations. He turned back to Reynolds. Thank you for telling me this. It doesn't answer all my questions, but it's more than I've had before. Reynolds nodded, feeling a subtle shift in their relationship. Not friendship, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. There's more to the story, Reynolds said carefully. Details about the modified T-62, about what happened after your father's death. But that would have to be part of a larger conversation. As part of the documentary, Marcus asked? Perhaps, Reynolds said, if it can be done responsibly, respectfully. Marcus studied him for a long moment. You've carried this for 30 years, haven't you? The responsibility for what happened that day. Reynolds didn't answer directly, but his silence was confirmation enough. I need time to process this, Marcus said finally, to reconsider what this documentary means now. Take the time you need, Reynolds replied. I've waited 3 decades to tell this story. I can wait a little longer. As Marcus left the room, Reynolds remained seated, feeling both burdened and somehow lightened by having shared part of the truth. He knew there would be more difficult conversations ahead, about the classified mission, about the modified T-62 that had been the objective, about the decisions made in the chaos of a battle that officially never happened. But for the first time in years, Reynolds felt the possibility that confronting the past might lead not just to pain, but perhaps to some measure of resolution, for himself and for the son of the man who had died under his command. Outside, the Georgia sun was setting, casting long shadows across the grounds of Fort Benning. Tomorrow would bring more filming, more technical discussions of tank warfare. But something fundamental had changed. This was no longer just about documenting the capabilities of steel machines. It was about honoring the human beings who had commanded them, fought in them, and sometimes died in them. And perhaps most importantly, it was about the truth. Complicated, messy, and long overdue. The morning sun cast long shadows across the proving grounds of Fort Benning as Reynolds watched a restored T-62 rumble across the uneven terrain. The Soviet tank moved with surprising agility for its size, its torsion bar suspension absorbing the bumps and dips of the test course. Behind the camera, Marcus Wilson tracked the vehicle's movement, his professional focus momentarily overriding the personal tension that had developed between them. 3 days had passed since their private conversation about Sergeant Wilson's death. 3 days in which they had maintained a professional distance, each processing the implications of what had been revealed. The documentary production had continued, with Reynolds providing detailed technical analysis of tank capabilities and battlefield tactics. But the undercurrent of unresolved history remained. "Cut," Lisa called as the T-62 completed its demonstration run. "That's perfect. Captain Reynolds, are you ready for the comparison segment?" Reynolds nodded, walking toward the position where an M60 Patton tank was parked beside the T-62. The juxtaposition of American and Soviet design philosophies was striking even at a glance. The production team had arranged this rare opportunity to film the two Cold War adversaries side by side. "We'll have you walk through the key differences," Lisa explained, focusing on the aspects you mentioned yesterday about design philosophy and combat effectiveness. Reynolds positioned himself between the two tanks, aware of Marcus adjusting camera angles to capture both vehicles in frame. Despite the tension between them, Reynolds had to admit the young man was skilled at his craft, finding compelling visual compositions that would translate the technical details into engaging footage. "Ready when you are," Lisa said, standing beside the primary camera. Reynolds gathered his thoughts, then began speaking with the authority that came from decades of experience. "What we have here represents the fundamental difference in tank design philosophy between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War," he explained, gesturing to the vehicles flanking him. "The M60 Patton, introduced in 1960 versus the T-62, introduced in 1961. These tanks were contemporaries, designed to potentially face each other on the battlefields of Europe." He turned first to the American tank. The M60 prioritized crew protection, fire control accuracy, and mechanical reliability. It weighed approximately 50 tons, had a 4-man crew, and mounted a 105mm rifled gun. Moving to the Soviet tank, Reynolds continued, the T-62, by contrast, weighed just 40 tons, had a 3-man crew, and mounted the world's first 115mm smoothbore tank gun. The Soviets sacrificed crew comfort, internal volume, and some mechanical reliability to create a lower profile, lighter vehicle that could be mass-produced. As Reynolds detailed the specific technical differences, he found himself warming to the subject, momentarily setting aside the personal complications of the project. "The most revolutionary aspect of the T-62 was its turret design," he explained, placing his hand on the curved steel surface. "This hemispherical shape was mathematically optimized to provide the maximum internal volume with the minimum amount of armor material. It's an elegant solution to the eternal problem of tank design balancing protection, mobility, and firepower." The filming continued through the morning, with Reynolds demonstrating various features of both tanks, explaining how their designs reflected not just technical capabilities, but national strategic doctrines. The Soviet approach emphasized numerical superiority and simplified operation for conscript crews, while the American approach favored technological advantage and crew survivability. During a lunch break, Reynolds found himself sitting alone at a table in the base cafeteria, reviewing notes for the afternoon session. He looked up to find Michael Thompson sliding a tray onto the table across from him. "How's it going with the Wilson kid?" Thompson asked without preamble. Reynolds sighed. "Complicated. I told him some of what happened during Dawn Runner, not everything." Thompson nodded, understanding the significance. "How'd he take it?" "Better than I expected. He's processing it." Reynolds took a sip of coffee. He's a professional, I'll give him that. Hasn't let it affect the work. You gonna tell him the rest? About the modified T-62? Reynolds glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. I'm still deciding. Some of that information might still be sensitive. Thompson gave him a skeptical look. After 30 years, the Soviet Union doesn't even exist anymore. It's not about the Soviets, Reynolds said quietly. It's about what we did afterward, the decisions that were made. Before Thompson could respond, Lisa Mitchell approached their table, tablet in hand. Captain Reynolds, I've been reviewing yesterday's footage, and I had some follow-up questions about the T-62's armor effectiveness against American ammunition types. Reynolds welcomed the technical diversion. What specifically did you want to know? You mentioned that West German testing showed the T-62 turret could withstand 105mm APDS rounds from 800 meters, but the hull was vulnerable at longer ranges. Do you have more details on those tests? Reynolds was impressed by her research. The West German tests were not widely discussed in mainstream military histories. The Germans conducted comprehensive tests on captured T-62s in 1974, he explained. They found that the DM-13 APDS round, fired from the L7 105mm gun, could penetrate the whole frontal armor at about 1/800 meters. But the turret was significantly more resistant due to its rounded shape and the resulting higher effective thickness at most impact angles. As they discussed the technical details, Reynolds noticed Marcus entering the cafeteria, camera in hand. The young man hesitated when he saw Reynolds with Thompson and Lisa, then deliberately chose a table across the room. Lisa followed Reynolds' gaze. He's still processing what you told him. Give him time. Reynolds nodded, though he wondered if time would be enough to bridge the gulf between them. The truth about Dawn Runner was more complicated than he had revealed so far, with implications that reached beyond one soldier's heroic death. After lunch, the filming shifted to interior shots of both tanks. Reynolds demonstrated the cramped conditions inside the T-62, explaining how the three-man crew had to work together efficiently in the confined space. The commander in a T-62 had to double as the gun loader, he explained, ducking through the turret hatch. This created a significant disadvantage in combat. When the commander was busy loading the gun, he couldn't observe the battlefield or direct the tank effectively. American tanks, with their four-man crews, allowed each crew member to focus on their primary task. Inside the Soviet tank, the air was heavy with the scent of steel and old lubricants. Reynolds ran his hand along the gunner's controls, pointing out the manual systems that lacked the sophisticated computerized fire control of Western tanks. Despite these limitations, the T-62 was a formidable opponent because of its gun, he continued. The 115mm smoothbore could fire armor-piercing fin, stabilized discarding sabot rounds with excellent penetrating power for its era. In the hands of a well-trained crew, it could destroy any NATO tank of the 1960s and early 1970s. As Reynolds emerged from the T-62's hatch, he found Marcus waiting with his camera, capturing the exit sequence. Good material, Marcus said professionally. Your technical knowledge really comes through. Reynolds nodded, accepting the neutral comment as an attempt at normal working relations. The T-62 has a fascinating design history. Its strengths and weaknesses perfectly encapsulate the Soviet approach to armored warfare. Lisa wants to film you next in the Abrams, for contrast, Marcus said. If you're ready, lead the way. As they walked toward the modern American tank positioned at the end of the row, Marcus spoke without looking at Reynolds. I've been thinking about what you told me, he said, his voice carefully neutral. About Dawn Runner and my father. Reynolds kept his pace steady. And? There are gaps in the story, Marcus said. You mentioned a modified T-62 with advanced technology. What was special about it? Why was it worth risking lives after the ceasefire? Reynolds considered how much to reveal. The intelligence suggested it had an experimental armor configuration and possibly an enhanced fire control system. The technical details were above my pay grade. We were just told it was a high-value acquisition target. It wasn't the complete truth, but it wasn't entirely false either. Reynolds watched Marcus's face for his reaction. So my father died for a technical intelligence mission, Marcus said, a hint of bitterness creeping into his voice. Your father died saving civilian lives, Reynolds corrected firmly. Whatever the mission objectives were, his actions transcended them. That's what you should remember. They reached the Abrams, and the conversation was put on hold as the filming requirements took precedence. Reynolds spent the next hour explaining the technological leap represented by the M1, with its sophisticated composite armor, digital fire control system, and turbine engine. By late afternoon, the day's filming was complete. The crew began packing up equipment while Lisa reviewed footage with her production assistant. Reynolds was preparing to leave when Thompson approached him. "Some of us are heading to O'Malley's tonight," he said, referring to a bar popular with military personnel just outside the base. "You should join us, the crew too." Reynolds hesitated. "I'm not sure that's a good idea." "It's just drinks," Thompson pressed. "Might help diffuse some of the tension. Besides, I'm flying back to California tomorrow. Who knows when we'll get another chance to raise a glass to old times." Put that way, Reynolds found it hard to refuse. "All right, I'll be there." O'Malley's was crowded when Reynolds arrived that evening. The walls were decorated with military memorabilia, unit patches, and photographs spanning conflicts from World War II to Afghanistan. Thompson waved from a corner table where he sat with several members of the production crew, including Lisa Mitchell. Reynolds made his way through the crowd, accepting a beer from Thompson as he sat down. "Where's Marcus?" he asked, noting the young man's absence. "Said he had footage to review," Lisa explained. "I told him it could wait, but he insisted." Reynolds nodded, unsurprised. The personal connection to the material made this more than just another film project for Marcus. "His loss," Thompson said, raising his glass, "to old tankers and new stories." They clinked glasses, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Lisa shared anecdotes from previous documentary projects, while Thompson regaled them with tales of training mishaps from Fort Irwin. Reynolds found himself relaxing slightly, the familiar environment and camaraderie easing some of the tension he had carried since the project began. After his second beer, Reynolds excused himself to the restroom. As he was returning to the table, he noticed a television above the bar playing news footage. He paused, attention caught by the image of a familiar desert landscape. The caption read, "Anniversary of Gulf War Victory Approaches." The screen showed archive footage of American tanks advancing across the Iraqi desert, followed by a segment about veterans' commemoration events planned for the coming month. "Hard to believe it's been 30 years, said a voice beside him. Reynolds turned to find an older man in civilian clothes watching the same broadcast. Something about him seemed familiar. "James Peterson," the man said, extending his hand. "2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, 1991. Reynolds shook the offered hand. "John Reynolds, same unit, Ghost Troop." Peterson's eyes widened in recognition. "Captain Reynolds? I was with Fox Troop during the advance. We were on your right flank at 73 Easting." The coincidence was remarkable. Two veterans from the same battle meeting by chance decades later. They exchanged brief recollections of that rainy February day, the confusion of battle, the surprising speed of the advance. "I heard you were involved in something after the main push," Peterson said, lowering his voice slightly. "Some special operation near Basra." Reynolds felt a chill. Dawn Runner had never been part of the official narrative, its details kept close among those directly involved. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," he said carefully. Peterson seemed to sense his reticence. "No matter. Ancient history now, right? Good to see you again, Captain." As the man moved away, Reynolds remained at the bar, unsettled by the encounter. How many people knew about Dawn Runner? How many had heard rumors or partial truths? He returned to the table, his mood noticeably dampened. Thompson gave him a questioning look, but Reynolds shook his head slightly. "Not here, not now." The evening concluded shortly after, with tomorrow's filming schedule requiring an early start. As they left the bar, Thompson pulled Reynolds aside in the parking lot. "What happened in there? You look like you saw a ghost." Reynolds glanced around before answering. "Guy at the bar knew about Dawn Runner, or at least knew something happened after the main offensive." Thompson frowned. "Who was he?" "Claims he was Fox Troop. Peterson." Reynolds shook his head. "I don't remember him specifically, but that doesn't mean anything. There were hundreds of men in the regiment." "Could be nothing," Thompson suggested. "Lots of rumors circulated after the war." "Maybe," Reynolds conceded, though he wasn't convinced. "Still makes me wonder what else is out there, what people think they know." "All the more reason to set the record straight in this documentary," Thompson said. "Within the bounds of what's declassified, of course." Reynolds nodded, though he wasn't sure if any official declassification had ever occurred. Dawn Runner existed in a gray area. An operation conducted after the ceasefire, never formally acknowledged. "Get some rest," Thompson advised. "Tomorrow's another day of talking tanks." But as Reynolds drove back to his apartment, his mind was not on the technical specifications of Cold War armored vehicles. It was on the secrets that had remained buried for 3 decades, and whether this documentary project might be the catalyst that finally brought them to light. Chapter 5. warriors' hearts. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, a perfect day for outdoor filming. The production team had arranged for Reynolds to demonstrate the mobility characteristics of both the T-62 and the M60, comparing their performance over varying terrain. When Reynolds arrived at the testing ground, he was surprised to see Marcus already there, setting up camera equipment alone. "Early start?" Reynolds asked, approaching cautiously. Marcus nodded without looking up from his work. "Wanted to catch the morning light on the vehicles. Makes the details stand out better." Reynolds recognized the professional explanation as an excuse. The young man had likely been avoiding the social gathering the night before. "About yesterday," Reynolds began. "What I told you about the modified T-62? You held back," Marcus interrupted, finally meeting his gaze. "I understand. Some information might still be classified. But this isn't just an academic exercise for me. This is my father's legacy." Reynolds considered his response carefully. "What if I told you the full story might complicate that legacy? That the truth is rarely as clear-cut as we want it to be?" Marcus straightened, his expression challenging. "Are you saying my father wasn't a hero?" "No," Reynolds replied firmly. "Your father was one of the bravest men I ever served with. But the mission context, it's more complicated than a simple intelligence grab." Before Marcus could respond, Lisa and the rest of the crew arrived, effectively ending their private conversation. The young man returned to his professional demeanor, though Reynolds could see the questions burning behind his eyes. The morning's filming focused on mobility demonstrations, with Reynolds explaining how the T-62's lighter weight and wider tracks gave it advantages in certain terrain despite its less powerful engine. Soviet tanks were designed with the European battlefield in mind, he explained for the camera. They needed to cross rivers, navigate forests, and traverse soft ground. The T-62 could ford water obstacles up to 1.4 meters deep without preparation, and with the proper equipment, it could snorkel through water up to 5 meters deep. Reynolds directed the driver to demonstrate the T-62's maneuverability, explaining how its suspension system worked to maintain ground contact across uneven terrain. "The suspension featured 5 pairs of road wheels with torsion bars," he continued. "This provided a reasonably smooth ride while keeping the overall profile low. The Soviets accepted a less comfortable ride if it meant making the tank a smaller target." Throughout the demonstrations, Reynolds maintained his professional focus, though he was acutely aware of Marcus behind the camera, capturing every word, every explanation. The young man's dual role as filmmaker and son of a fallen comrade created a unique tension that permeated the production. During the lunch break, Reynolds found himself alone at a picnic table set up for the crew, reviewing technical notes for the afternoon session. He looked up to see Lisa approaching with 2 sandwiches and bottles of water. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, sitting across from him. "You've been doing great work this morning. The footage is excellent." "Thanks," Reynolds replied, accepting the offered food. "Your team is professional. Makes it easy." Lisa studied him for a moment. "Something's different today, between you and Marcus." Reynolds took a bite of his sandwich, buying time to consider his response. "We had a brief conversation this morning. Unresolved questions about his father." "He told me you mentioned a modified T-62, Lisa said. "Part of a classified mission after the ceasefire." Reynolds frowned. He shouldn't be discussing that with others. "I'm not others," Lisa pointed out. "I'm the director of this documentary. And if there's an untold story that connects directly to our subject matter, I need to know about it." Reynolds set down his sandwich. "Lisa, some aspects of Desert Storm remain sensitive, even after 30 years. Not everything that happened in theater is appropriate for public consumption." "Is that your assessment or the Pentagon's?" she asked, her tone sharpening slightly. "Because if there's a story here about a secret mission involving Soviet technology, that seems directly relevant to a documentary about American and Soviet tank development." Reynolds could see the journalist in her emerging, the instinct to pursue a hidden story. It was exactly what he had feared when agreeing to participate in the project. "The official position is that all combat operations ceased with the declared ceasefire," he said carefully. "Any suggestion otherwise could have diplomatic implications, even now." Lisa leaned forward. "Captain Reynolds, my father served under you. He respected you immensely. But he also believed in the importance of historical truth. If something happened that has been concealed from the public record, don't you think it deserves to be known, especially if it involves the sacrifice of men like Marcus's father?" The question hit Reynolds where he was most vulnerable, in his sense of obligation to the men who had served under him. Before he could formulate a response, They were interrupted by Thompson's arrival. "Hope I'm not interrupting," he said, sensing the tension. "The tech team needs to know if we're still planning to do the comparative firing demonstration this afternoon." Lisa stood, gathering her half-eaten lunch. "We are. I'll go confirm the arrangements." As she walked away, Thompson took her place at the table. "Problems?" "She's pressing about Dawn Runner," Reynolds said quietly. "Sees it as a journalistic opportunity." Thompson grimaced. "Can't blame her for that. It's what journalists do." "This isn't just about revealing classified operations," Reynolds said, lowering his voice further. "If the full story comes out, it raises questions about decisions made at the highest levels and about what happened to that modified T-62 afterward." Thompson's expression grew serious. "You think it could go that far after all this time?" "I don't know," Reynolds admitted. "But once you start pulling at threads, it's hard to control what unravels." The afternoon session focused on weapons systems, with Reynolds explaining the fundamental differences between Western rifled tank guns and the Soviet smoothbore technology pioneered in the T-62. "The smoothbore design eliminated the spin imparted by rifling," he explained, standing beside the T-62's 150 mm gun. "This allowed for higher muzzle velocities with fin-stabilized ammunition, improving penetrating power against armor. The U-5TS gun of the T-62 could fire its armor-piercing round at nearly 1,700 meters per second, fast enough to defeat the frontal armor of contemporary NATO tanks at battlefield ranges. The crew had arranged for simulation firing, using special effects and computer graphics that would be added in post-production. Reynolds worked with the technical team to ensure the demonstrations accurately represented the performance characteristics of each weapon system. When firing on the move, the differences between Soviet and American technology became critical," Reynolds continued. "The T-62 initially lacked a sophisticated stabilization system, making accurate fire while moving difficult. American tanks, with their advanced fire control systems, could effectively engage targets while traveling at speed, a significant tactical advantage." Throughout the afternoon, Reynolds noticed Marcus becoming increasingly engaged with the technical material, asking specific follow-up questions between takes, seemingly setting aside their personal tension in favor of professional curiosity. As the day's filming concluded, Reynolds found Marcus reviewing footage on a portable monitor. "Getting what you need?" Reynolds asked. Marcus nodded without looking up. "The technical material's excellent, very detailed." Reynolds hesitated, then decided to extend an olive branch. "Your father was fascinated by the technical aspects too, always wanted to understand how things worked, not just how to operate them." This drew Marcus's attention. "He was one of the most mechanically inclined soldiers I knew," Reynolds confirmed. "Could troubleshoot almost any issue with our tank. Saved us countless hours of maintenance time." A ghost of a smile crossed Marcus's face. "My mom used to say he could fix anything. I thought she was just building him up for me." "No, that was real," Reynolds assured him. "When our hydraulic system failed during a training exercise in Germany, your father jury-rigged a solution that got us back to base when most crews would have abandoned the vehicle." For a moment, they shared something approaching camaraderie, united by the memory of a man both had lost in different ways. But the moment was fleeting. "Why won't you tell me the whole truth about Dawn Runner?" Marcus asked suddenly. "About the modified T-62? I'm not a child needing protection from reality." Reynolds sighed. "It's not about protecting you. It's about potential ramifications. Not everything that happens in war fits neatly into official narratives. Sometimes operations exist in gray areas, morally and legally." "So there was something illegal about the mission?" Marcus pressed. "Not illegal," Reynolds corrected quickly. "Complicated, politically sensitive, and not just because it occurred after the ceasefire." Marcus studied him intently. "What was so special about this T-62 that made it worth risking lives to capture?" Reynolds glanced around, ensuring they weren't overheard. "The intelligence suggested it had been modified with a new type of reactive armor and possibly an enhanced fire control system. Technology that wasn't supposed to exist in the Iraqi inventory. Technology that indicated direct Soviet technical support beyond what had been officially acknowledged. And finding this tank would prove that connection." "That was the theory," Reynolds acknowledged. "But what we actually found was more significant than anticipated." Before Marcus could press further, Lisa approached, carrying a satellite phone. "Captain Reynolds, there's someone who wants to speak with you." Reynolds frowned, taking the phone. "Reynolds here." "Captain," came a crisp, official voice. "This is Colonel James Harrison, Pentagon Public Affairs Office. I understand you're participating in a documentary about tank warfare." Reynolds felt a chill. That's correct, Colonel. I'd like to arrange a meeting with you and the production team tomorrow morning. There are some matters of national security we need to discuss regarding the scope of this project. May I ask what specific concerns have been raised? Reynolds inquired, keeping his tone neutral. I'd prefer to discuss that in person, the colonel replied. 0900 tomorrow at the base commander's office. Please ensure all key production personnel attend. The call ended abruptly, leaving Reynolds staring at the phone. What was that about? Lisa asked, concern evident in her voice. Pentagon Public Affairs wants a meeting tomorrow morning, Reynolds said, handing back the phone. Concerns about the scope of the documentary. Lisa's expression hardened. They can't censor us. This isn't classified information we're discussing. Not yet, Reynolds thought, but didn't say. Aloud, he simply stated, we should comply with the meeting request. Hear what they have to say. As the crew packed up for the day, Reynolds pulled Thompson aside. Pentagon's sending someone tomorrow, he said quietly. Public Affairs. But you know that's not the real department involved. Thompson nodded grimly. Someone's nervous about what might come out in this documentary. Question is, how did they even know about it? Reynolds mused. We haven't released any footage, haven't made any public announcements. Someone's watching, Thompson concluded. The question is, why now, after all these years? Reynolds had no answer, but the development confirmed his worst fears. The buried secrets of Dawn Runner were stirring, and powerful interests still wanted them contained. That evening, Reynolds sat alone in his apartment, a glass of bourbon in hand, contemplating the next day's meeting. The television played silently in the background, a news program discussing anniversary commemorations for Desert Storm. His phone rang, displaying a number he didn't recognize. Reynolds, he answered. Captain, this is Marcus Wilson. The young man's voice sounded tense. Something strange just happened. A man approached me outside my hotel, claimed to be from Army intelligence, asked what I knew about Dawn Runner. Reynolds sat up straight. What did you tell him? Nothing. Said I didn't know what he was talking about. He left, but it felt threatening. Where are you now? Back in my room. Lisa's meeting with the production team down in the hotel restaurant. Reynolds made a quick decision. Stay there, I'm coming over. Don't discuss this with anyone else until I arrive. He grabbed his keys and headed for the door, mind racing. The Pentagon meeting scheduled for tomorrow suddenly seemed more ominous. Someone was very interested in what might be revealed about a 30-year-old covert operation, interested enough to directly approach the son of a soldier who died during that mission. As Reynolds drove through the night toward the hotel, he wondered how much longer the secrets of Dawn Runner could remain buried, and what the cost of their revelation might be not just to national security, but to the memory of men like Marcus Wilson Sr. Chapter 6. Internal Battle. The hotel lobby was quiet when Reynolds arrived 20 minutes later. He texted Marcus to announce his presence, and within moments the young man appeared from the elevator, his expression tense. Thanks for coming, Marcus said, leading Reynolds to a small seating area away from the front desk. I wasn't sure who else to call. You did the right thing, Reynolds assured him. Tell me exactly what happened. Marcus described the encounter in detail. He had been returning to the hotel after purchasing some camera equipment when a man in civilian clothes approached him in the parking lot. He knew my name, Marcus explained. Asked if I was working on a documentary about Desert Storm. Then he specifically mentioned Dawn Runner and my father in the same sentence. When I played dumb, he gave me his card and said we should talk before things got complicated. Do you have the card? Reynolds asked. Marcus produced a simple white business card with only a name and phone number. Martin Brooks, consultant. No agency, no official position, Reynolds noted. Classic intelligence community approach when they want deniability. So he really was intelligence? Or someone wanting you to think so, Reynolds replied. Either way, it means our documentary has attracted attention from people who prefer certain aspects of Desert Storm remain unexplored. Marcus leaned forward. Captain Reynolds, what the hell was Dawn Runner? What was so important about that modified T-62 that people are still concerned about it 30 years later? Reynolds considered his options. The escalating situation suggested that the truth might emerge regardless of his caution. Perhaps it was better coming from him than from some sanitized official version, or worse, from the incomplete understanding of those who hadn't been there. Not here, he decided. Too public. Is there somewhere private we can talk? Marcus thought for a moment. Productions rented a meeting room for equipment storage. It should be empty now. They took the elevator to the third floor. Marcus using his key card to access a small conference room where cases of camera equipment lined one wall. He closed the door behind them and turned expectantly to Reynolds. The modified T-62 was more significant than I initially told you, Reynolds began, choosing his words carefully. Intelligence had indicated it contained an experimental Soviet technology, but what we actually found went beyond that. Marcus remained silent, waiting for him to continue. When we located the tank at the Republican Guard facility, we discovered it wasn't just modified with reactive armor or an enhanced fire control system. It had been equipped with an entirely new type of protection system, something our intelligence community had only heard rumors about. What kind of system? An active protection system designed to intercept incoming anti-tank rounds before they could impact the armor, Reynolds explained. The Soviets called it Drozd. It used radar to detect incoming projectiles and launched countermeasures to destroy them in flight. Marcus frowned. That technology exists today. It's not exactly a state secret. Today, yes, Reynolds agreed. But in 1991, it represented a potentially game-changing advancement. NATO had nothing comparable in the field. If the Soviets had managed to perfect and deploy this system widely, it would have significantly reduced the effectiveness of our anti-tank weapons. So the mission was to capture this technology? That was the official objective, Reynolds confirmed. But what we found complicated matters. The system installed on this T-62 wasn't just a Soviet design. It contained components with American manufacturing markings. Marcus's eyes widened. American technology in a Soviet defensive system? How is that possible? That's what made the mission so sensitive, Reynolds said. It suggested either Soviet espionage had compromised American defense contractors, or worse, that someone had been deliberately transferring technology. A traitor, Marcus concluded. Or a sanctioned back-channel program that had gone off the books, Reynolds added. The Cold War created strange bedfellows sometimes, especially as it was winding down. Marcus processed this information, his filmmaker's mind clearly piecing together the implications. So when my father died during this mission, he died protecting not just Iraqi civilians, but potentially uncovering a major security breach. Reynolds completed the thought. The problem was, by that point, the ceasefire was in effect. Officially, we shouldn't have been conducting operations at all, let alone ones that might expose embarrassing connections between American technology and enemy weapon systems. So they buried it, Marcus said, anger creeping into his voice. Classified the mission, sanitized my father's death, all to avoid political embarrassment. It was more complicated than that, Reynolds insisted. The technology transfer implications potentially reached high levels. There were concerns about destabilizing relations with the Soviets at a crucial moment in history. The Berlin Wall had only fallen a little over a year earlier. The Soviet Union itself was on the verge of collapse. Politics, Marcus spat the word. My father died and they reduced it to a footnote because of politics. Reynolds couldn't argue with the assessment. Your father deserved better. They all did. The men who took risks for their country deserved to have their sacrifices acknowledged honestly. What happened to the tank, Marcus asked. The modified T-62 with this hybrid protection system? Reynolds hesitated. This was where the story became even more problematic. After your father's death, we completed the mission. We secured the tank and called in a recovery team. It was supposed to be transported to a secure facility for analysis. But it never arrived, Reynolds said quietly. Somewhere between the handoff to the recovery team and the designated analysis facility, the modified T-62 disappeared. Marcus stared at him in disbelief. Disappeared? An entire tank? Along with all documentation we had gathered at the site, Reynolds confirmed. The official explanation was that it had been mistakenly included in equipment designated for destruction after the conflict. An administrative error. You didn't believe that, Marcus observed. None of us did, Reynolds admitted. But we were soldiers. We followed orders. When told to drop the matter, we did. Or at least, we appeared to. What does that mean? Reynolds stood, pacing the small room as memories he had suppressed for decades resurfaced. Your father wasn't just brave, Marcus. He was observant. Before he left the tank to help those civilians, he had been documenting the modified T-62 with a personal camera, taking photographs of key components, technical markings. When he realized he was going into danger, he handed the film to me for safekeeping. Marcus leaned forward intently. You had evidence of the American components. Reynolds nodded. I did. And after the tank disappeared and the mission was classified, that film became extremely sensitive material. What did you do with it? Initially, nothing. I was a career officer. I followed the chain of command. But when the official story about your father's death was sanitized, when his connection to this significant discovery was erased, I made a copy of the photographs. Insurance, I told myself. Do you still have them? Marcus asked, his voice hushed with the implication. Reynolds met his gaze steadily. I kept them secure for 30 years. Never showed them to anyone, never used them. Until now, Marcus concluded. I haven't decided yet, Reynolds corrected. This documentary project has forced me to reconsider many things I thought were long buried. But releasing those photographs would have serious implications, even now. They prove my father didn't die in vain, Marcus argued. They prove he was part of uncovering something important, something someone wanted concealed. They also potentially implicate people who may still hold positions of power, Reynolds cautioned. People who might go to considerable lengths to ensure certain questions remain unasked. Like sending Pentagon officials to meetings about documentary projects, Marcus suggested, or having intelligence officers approach filmmakers in hotel parking lots. Exactly. Marcus absorbed this information in silence, the weight of its implications evident in his expression. Finally, he asked, "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you deserve to know the truth about your father," Reynolds replied. "And because I'm tired of carrying this alone. For 30 years, I've questioned whether I made the right choices, whether keeping silent was an act of loyalty or cowardice." "What about Thompson? Does he know about the photographs?" Reynolds shook his head. "No one does. Not until you, just now." The admission created a shift in the dynamic between them, a sharing of confidence that transcended their previous tensions. "So what happens tomorrow at this Pentagon meeting?" Marcus asked. "They'll likely request we limit the documentary to the officially acknowledged aspects of Desert Storm," Reynolds predicted. "They'll cite national security concerns, ongoing diplomatic sensitivities. They'll be polite but firm. And if we refuse, they have various forms of pressure they can apply. Revocation of filming permits on military installations, denial of access to archived footage, subtle career implications for current military personnel who participate." Marcus considered this. "But they can't legally prevent us from telling the story, can they? First Amendment and all that." "No," Reynolds agreed, "but they can make it significantly more difficult to tell it well or accurately." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Lisa Mitchell's voice called, "Marcus, are you in there? The production meeting's wrapping up." Marcus and Reynolds exchanged a look, silently agreeing to pause their discussion. "Coming," Marcus called, then lowered his voice into Reynolds. "We need to figure this out before tomorrow's meeting." Reynolds nodded. "Get some rest. We'll continue this in the morning." When Marcus opened the door, Lisa stood in the hallway, her expression shifting from mild annoyance to surprise at seeing Reynolds. "Captain Reynolds, I didn't realize you were here." "Just discussing some technical details with Marcus," Reynolds explained smoothly. "Preparation for tomorrow's filming." If Lisa was suspicious of this explanation, she didn't show it. "Well, since you're here, you should know we've formulated our approach for the Pentagon meeting. We're not going to let them dictate our editorial content." Reynolds managed a tight smile. "It's always good to be prepared. I should get going. Early start tomorrow." As he walked past Lisa toward the elevator, he heard her ask Marcus, "Was that really about technical details? You both look pretty intense." Reynolds didn't hear Marcus's response. The elevator doors closed, leaving him alone with the weight of decisions yet to be made. The truth about Dawn Runner had remained buried for 3 decades, contained by classification, compartmentalization, and the natural reticence of soldiers to question orders. Now that truth threatened to emerge, with unpredictable consequences for all involved. The Pentagon's sudden interest suggested that someone still considered this information sensitive, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, even after multiple reorganizations of the defense establishment, even after the participants had aged into retirement. As Reynolds drove back to his apartment, he wondered about the photographs secured in a safety deposit box at his bank. Yellowing physical evidence of a connection that someone had gone to great lengths to conceal. Tomorrow's meeting would indicate how far they might still go to keep that connection secret. In the quiet of his apartment, Reynolds poured himself a final bourbon and considered his options. The meeting was scheduled for 0900. The bank opened at 0800. There was time to retrieve the photographs before facing the Pentagon representatives, time to decide whether 3 decades of silence was enough. His military career had been built on following orders, on trust in the chain of command. But his identity as a soldier had been equally shaped by loyalty to the men he led, the men who had entrusted their lives to his decisions. Men like Marcus Wilson Sr., who had died believing his sacrifice mattered, that the truth he helped uncover would make a difference. Reynolds set down his glass and made his decision. Tomorrow, before the Pentagon meeting, he would retrieve the photographs. Whether he would share them remained to be seen, but having them in hand would provide options, leverage if necessary. As he prepared for bed, Reynolds found himself thinking of David Mitchell's words to his daughter, that there was more to what happened at 73 Easting than made it into the official reports. Mitchell hadn't been part of Dawn Runner, but he had been close enough to Reynolds afterward to sense there was something unresolved, something that continued to weigh on his former commander. Perhaps Mitchell had hoped his daughter would one day help bring that truth to light. Perhaps this documentary, initially conceived as a technical history of tank warfare, was meant to become something more significant, a reckoning with the complicated moral terrain that soldiers navigate in service to their country, where duty, loyalty, and truth do not always point in the same direction. With that thought, Reynolds turned out the light, knowing that tomorrow would bring decisions that could not be undone, revelations that could not be reclaimed once shared. The battle for the truth about Dawn Runners was approaching its final phase, 30 years after the guns of Desert Storm had fallen silent. Morning arrived with a sense of inevitability. Reynolds woke before his alarm, dressed with military precision, and drove to his bank as it opened. The safety deposit box contained what few true valuables he possessed: his father's service medals, the deed to a small cabin in the Georgia mountains, and a weathered manila envelope sealed 30 years ago. He withdrew the envelope and returned to his car, sitting for a moment with the unopened package on his lap. Inside were 24 photographs taken by Marcus Wilson Sr. on that fateful day in '91, images that documented what should not have existed: American technological components integrated into an experimental Soviet tank defense system. Reynolds slipped the envelope into his jacket and drove to Fort Benning, arriving 30 minutes before the scheduled Pentagon meeting. He found Lisa and Marcus waiting in the lobby of the headquarters building, tension evident in their postures. "Any idea what to expect?" Lisa asked as Reynolds approached. "Standard procedure," he replied, keeping his voice measured. "They'll cite national security concerns, request limitations on content, be polite but firm." "We're not changing our documentary based on vague security concerns," Lisa stated, "not without specific, substantiated reasons." Reynolds nodded, then caught Marcus's eye. "Could I have a quick word in private?" They stepped away from Lisa, moving toward a quiet corner of the lobby. "I retrieved the photographs," Reynolds said quietly. "They're exactly as I remembered." Marcus's eyes widened slightly. "Are you going to show them?" "Not yet," Reynolds cautioned. "Let's hear what they have to say first." But having them provides options. Before Marcus could respond, a uniformed officer approached. "Captain Reynolds, Colonel Harrison is ready for you now." They were escorted to a conference room where three men waited. Colonel James Harrison, a trim man in his 50s wearing dress uniform, stood to greet them. Beside him sat an older civilian in an expensive suit and a younger man with the unmistakable bearing of intelligence community personnel. "Captain Reynolds," Harrison began, "thank you for coming. Ms. Mitchell, Mr. Wilson, I appreciate your cooperation as well." Introductions followed. The older civilian was identified as Richard Blackwood, a Department of Defense consultant. The younger man was Thomas Mercer, described vaguely as a technical advisor from the Pentagon. Once they were seated, Colonel Harrison opened a folder before him. "I'll be direct," he said. "It has come to our attention that your documentary project may be venturing into areas with national security implications, specifically aspects of Operation Desert Storm that remain sensitive even 30 years later." Lisa leaned forward. "Colonel, we're producing a documentary about tank technology and battlefield tactics, primarily focused on the technical aspects of Soviet versus American designs. These are historical facts, not classified information." "In general terms, you're correct," Harrison acknowledged. "However, we understand Captain Reynolds may have been sharing information about operations conducted after the official ceasefire, operations that remain classified." All eyes turned to Reynolds, who maintained a neutral expression. "I've been careful to limit my comments to officially acknowledged engagements, Colonel." "Nevertheless," Harrison continued, "we have concerns, particularly regarding any discussion of what you referred to as Dawn Runner." The specific reference confirmed Reynolds' suspicion that someone was monitoring their project closely. Marcus tensed beside him, but remained silent. "What exactly are you requesting, Colonel?" Reynolds asked, his voice level. "We're asking that your documentary avoid any mention of operations conducted after February 28, 1991, the official end of hostilities. Additionally, any discussion of Soviet tank technology should be limited to specifications that have been publicly acknowledged in official documentation. Lisa frowned. That's an extremely broad restriction. It would prevent us from exploring the actual battlefield performance of these vehicles. National security requires certain compromises, Ms. Mitchell, the civilian Blackwood interjected. Some details of military operations remain sensitive despite the passage of time. What's sensitive about a 30-year-old ceasefire violation? Marcus asked suddenly, his voice carefully controlled. Or is it something else you're concerned about? Something about a modified T-62 tank? The atmosphere in this room shifted perceptibly. Harrison exchanged a glance with Mercer, the intelligence officer, who spoke for the first time. Mr. Wilson, I understand your personal interest in this matter given your father's service. However, I must caution against speculation about classified operations. It's not speculation, Marcus replied. My father died during this mission. I have a right to know why his sacrifice has been reduced to a footnote. Mercer's expression hardened. Sergeant Wilson died heroically in service to his country. That has never been in question. But the operational details surrounding his death remain classified for good reason. Reynolds studied the three men across the table, reading the subtle interplay of authority and concern. Harrison was simply following orders, a career officer doing his duty. Blackwood, despite his civilian status, carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to power. But it was Mercer who interested Reynolds most, the intelligence officer whose careful observations and precisely chosen words suggested deeper involvement. What if we agreed to submit any material related to post-ceasefire operations for review prior to inclusion? Lisa suggested, attempting a compromise. That would be a start, Harrison allowed, but our preference would be complete omission of these matters. Even if they represent historical truth, Lisa pressed. History is complex, Ms. Mitchell, Blackwood said smoothly. Not every aspect serves the national interest by being widely disseminated. Reynolds had heard enough. These were the same justifications, the same careful bureaucratic language that had buried the truth 30 years ago. He made his decision. Colonel, he said quietly, before we continue, I think there's something you should see. Reynolds withdrew the manila envelope from his jacket, placing it on the table. The action drew immediate attention from all three officials. What is that, Captain? Harrison asked, a new tension in his voice. Insurance, Reynolds replied. Photographs taken during Operation Dawn Runner by Sergeant Marcus Wilson Sr., documenting the modified T-62 tank and its components. Specifically, the American-manufactured components incorporated into what was supposed to be an exclusively Soviet active defense system. The reaction was immediate. Mercer reached for the envelope, but Reynolds placed his hand firmly on top of it. I've had these secured for 30 years, Reynolds continued. Never shared them, never used them, out of loyalty to the uniform and the chain of command. But I'm beginning to question whether that loyalty was misplaced. Captain Reynolds, Harrison said carefully, if those are classified materials, you're legally obligated to surrender them immediately. Technically, they were never classified, Reynolds countered, because officially they don't exist. Just like the mission during which Sergeant Wilson gave his life doesn't exist. This is bigger than one soldier's death, Captain, Blackwood interjected, his urbane manner slipping slightly. There are diplomatic and security implications you can't possibly understand. Then explain them, Reynolds challenged. If you want these photographs to remain private, convince me why the truth should stay buried. Why a man who died uncovering what appears to have been illegal technology transfer shouldn't have his full story told. A tense silence followed. Marcus stared at the envelope containing the photographic evidence of his father's final mission, while Lisa watched the unfolding confrontation with the keen assessment of a journalist, sensing a much larger story than she had anticipated. Finally, Mercer spoke. This discussion should continue in a secure environment, without civilian participants. No, Reynolds said firmly. Whatever you have to say can be said here to all of us. Otherwise, these photographs become part of the documentary record. Harrison glanced at his colleagues, then made a decision. Clear the room of recording devices. Ms. Mitchell, Mr. Wilson, I must insist you leave your phones and any other electronics here when we continue this conversation. Once they had complied and the room was verified secure, Blackwood took control of the conversation, his demeanor now that of someone accustomed to managing sensitive disclosures. What you found in 1991 was evidence of a compartmentalized technology sharing program, he explained. During the final years of the Cold War, certain elements within both American and Soviet defense establishments established unauthorized back channels. Treason, Reynolds stated bluntly. Unsanctioned initiative, Blackwood corrected, by individuals who believed the official posture of both nations was unnecessarily adversarial. They saw themselves as building bridges that might prevent nuclear confrontation. By sharing defensive technology, Marcus asked skeptically. By creating mutual dependencies, Blackwood clarified, insurance against total conflict. If Soviet tanks incorporated American components, it created a vulnerability they wouldn't risk exposing. The same was true in reverse. Reynolds frowned. You're saying this was some kind of rogue peace initiative? I'm not buying it. The components we found were advanced, cutting edge. That suggests high-level access, not idealistic mid-level officers. Mercer and Blackwood exchanged another glance before Mercer spoke. You're correct, Captain. The program had sanction at certain levels, just not the official ones. During periods of tension, unofficial channels sometimes become necessary. Plausible deniability is essential in such arrangements. So when Sergeant Wilson documented this connection, Reynolds said slowly, he wasn't just finding evidence of Soviet technological advancement. He was exposing a covert program that powerful people on both sides wanted to remain hidden. Precisely, Blackwood confirmed, which is why the modified T-62 disappeared after you secured it, why the mission was classified, why certain details were omitted from official records. My father died for nothing, Marcus said bitterly, for some secret game between superpowers. Your father died saving civilian lives, Reynolds corrected him firmly. Never forget that. Whatever the mission objectives, whatever the politics involved, his actions that day were honorable. Captain Reynolds is right, Harrison added unexpectedly. The circumstances were complex, but Sergeant Wilson's courage was unquestionable. Lisa, who had been listening intently, finally spoke. So you buried all this to avoid exposing an unauthorized technology exchange program. But the Cold War ended 30 years ago. The Soviet Union collapsed. Why is this still sensitive now? Blackwood shifted uncomfortably. Some of the individuals involved remained in positions of influence long after 1991 in both countries. Their decisions during this period, if fully exposed, could still have significant political and diplomatic repercussions. And that justifies continuing to obscure the truth? Lisa challenged. Denying recognition to those who served honorably? National security is rarely black and white, Ms. Mitchell, Mercer replied. We make complex calculations about what serves the greater good. Reynolds studied the three officials, sensing there was still something they weren't revealing. There's more to this, isn't there? It's not just about protecting reputations or avoiding diplomatic embarrassment. A heavy silence filled the room before Blackwood finally nodded. The program didn't end with the Cold War. The channels established during that period evolved. They remain operational in certain contexts, particularly regarding shared interests against emerging threats. The implication was clear. The unofficial connections between former adversaries had become a shadow network, operating outside normal diplomatic and military channels, serving purposes that might not withstand public scrutiny. So what happens now? Reynolds asked. That depends on you, Captain, Blackwood replied, on what you choose to do with those photographs and what Ms. Mitchell chooses to include in her documentary. Reynolds looked at Marcus, seeing in his expression the conflict between a son's desire for truth and recognition of his father's sacrifice, and the more complex reality of how that sacrifice fit into the larger geopolitical landscape. I need to think about this, Reynolds said finally. We all do. Colonel Harrison nodded. We'll adjourn for now, but I hope you'll consider the broader implications of your decisions. Not every truth serves the greater good by being widely known. As they gathered their belongings, Mercer approached Reynolds privately. Those photographs, he said quietly, they're more significant than you realize, not just for what they show, but for what they represent. A moment when history could have taken a different path. Reynolds held the intelligence officer's gaze. History is made of such moments, Mr. Mercer, and of the choices we make about which versions of it we allow to be told. They left the meeting with no firm resolution, the envelope of photographs still in Reynolds' possession, the future of the documentary still uncertain. Outside in the bright Georgia sunlight, Lisa turned to Reynolds and Marcus. What do we do now? She asked. Reynolds looked toward the distant silhouettes of tanks on the training grounds, steel sentinels representing both technological achievement and the human cost of conflict. We finish what we started, he said, but we do it right. Chapter 8, The Legacy of Steel. The production team regrouped at their hotel, processing the revelations from the Pentagon meeting. In a private conference room, Reynolds, Lisa, and Marcus discussed their options. We have three choices, Lisa summarized. We can omit any mention of Dawn Runner and proceed with the purely technical documentary we originally planned. We can include the full story and deal with the consequences. Or we can find some middle ground that acknowledges the truth without compromising current operations or security. If we include everything, they'll fight us every step, Marcus pointed out. Revoke our access to military installations, possibly take legal action regarding the photographs. And if we say nothing, we become complicit in bearing the truth, Lisa countered, including the full recognition your father deserves. They both looked to Reynolds, whose decades of military experience and personal stake in the events made his perspective crucial. There's another factor to consider, Reynolds said carefully. Thompson flies back to California today. If we proceed with the full story, he needs to be involved in that decision. He was there too. Lisa nodded. Can you contact him? See if he can delay his departure? Reynolds called Thompson, briefly explaining the situation without details that shouldn't be discussed over an unsecured line. Thompson agreed to postpone his flight and join them that evening. While waiting, the team continued work on the documentary's technical segments. Reynolds recorded detailed analysis of the T-62's mobility systems, comparing Soviet and American approaches to suspension design, track configuration, and power transmission. The T-62 used a torsion bar suspension with 5 road wheels, he explained for the camera. This provided reasonable ground pressure distribution while maintaining a relatively low profile. The Soviets prioritized a low silhouette over crew comfort, accepting a rougher ride to minimize the tank's visible target. Throughout the afternoon, Reynolds maintained professional focus, but his mind continually returned to the photographs and their implications. After 30 years of silence, the truth about Dawn Runner stood on the precipice of revelation. The consequences remained unpredictable, not just for national security as the Pentagon officials claimed, but for the legacy of men like Marcus Wilson Sr. That evening, Thompson arrived at the hotel, his expression grave. Reynolds brought him up to speed on the Pentagon meeting and the revelations about the covert technology exchange program. So they finally admitted it, Thompson said, shaking his head. I always suspected something wasn't right about that modified T-62. The components were too integrated to be Iraqi improvisation. The question is, what do we do now? Reynolds asked. These people deserve to know the truth about what happened, about the mission, about Wilson's actions. But if what Blackwood said is true, exposing everything could compromise ongoing operations, maybe even put people at risk. Thompson considered this. What about Wilson's son? What does he want? All eyes turned to Marcus, who had been unusually quiet since the Pentagon meeting. All my life, I've wanted to know what happened to my father, he said slowly, to understand why he died. Now I know he died saving civilians, regardless of the political complications surrounding the mission. That part matters more to me than exposing some shadowy technology exchange program. So you're suggesting we keep it quiet? Lisa asked, surprised. I'm saying we focus on what matters, Marcus clarified. My father's heroism, the reality of what tank crews faced in combat, the human story behind the technical specifications. We can acknowledge Dawn Runner without necessarily exposing all its classified details. Reynolds nodded slowly, seeing wisdom in the approach. A compromise. We tell the truth about Wilson's actions, about the mission existing, without detailing the specific technology or current implications. Would the Pentagon accept that? Lisa wondered. They might, Reynolds said, if we agree to certain parameters. If we focus on honoring the soldiers rather than exposing the politics. And the photographs? Thompson asked. Reynolds touched the envelope in his jacket pocket. We use them selectively. Show the modified T-62, but not the specific components that would reveal the American connection. Enough to validate the story without compromising current operations. I can work with that, Lisa decided. A documentary about the men inside the machines, about the real experiences of tank warfare, including missions that have remained classified until now, but respecting certain boundaries for legitimate security concerns. As they discussed the specifics, Reynolds noticed a subtle shift in Marcus's demeanor. The anger that had driven the young man's quest for truth seemed to be giving way to something more nuanced, an appreciation for the complex reality his father had navigated, and a desire to honor that reality truthfully but responsibly. There's one more thing, Reynolds said. If we're going to tell this story, we should include other perspectives, not just American tankers, but those who faced us across the battlefield. Iraqi veterans? Lisa asked, intrigued by the possibility. If possible, Reynolds confirmed, the T-62 crews who fought against us. Their experience matters too. That won't be easy to arrange, Lisa cautioned, but I have contacts who might help. International war correspondents who maintain relationships in the region. It would add a crucial dimension, Marcus agreed, his filmmaker's instincts engaging with the concept. The complete picture of tank warfare from both sides of the conflict. The next morning, Reynolds called Colonel Harrison requesting another meeting to discuss a compromise approach. Harrison agreed, though he sounded skeptical. When they reconvened at Fort Benning later that day, Reynolds presented their proposal, a documentary that would acknowledge Operation Dawn Runner and honor Sergeant Wilson's sacrifice, while respecting legitimate security concerns about specific technologies and current operations. We're not interested in exposing state secrets or compromising ongoing security arrangements, Reynolds explained. We want to tell the human story behind the machines, the experiences of the men who fought, their courage, their decisions in complex circumstances. Harrison listened carefully, occasionally glancing at Mercer and Blackwood. When Reynolds finished, Harrison leaned forward. I'll need specifics, exactly what you intend to reveal and what you agree to omit. Over the next hour, they negotiated parameters. The documentary would acknowledge the mission to secure a modified T-62, but not detail the American components or the covert exchange program. It would focus on Wilson's heroism in saving civilians and the tactical challenges the tank crew faced. Selected photographs would be used to validate the narrative, but those showing specific technological components would remain classified. We also want to include Iraqi perspectives, Lisa added. Former T-62 crew members who fought against American forces. Their experiences are part of this history too. This request caused visible discomfort among the officials, but after a brief private consultation, they reluctantly agreed with the stipulation that any Iraqi veterans interviewed would be subject to background checks and their comments reviewed for security concerns. One more condition, Reynolds said as the meeting concluded. Sergeant Marcus Wilson Sr. receives proper recognition for his actions during Dawn Runner. Not just in our documentary, but in official military records. The sanitized account of his death gets corrected. Harrison hesitated, then nodded. I believe that can be arranged. His heroism in saving civilians was never in dispute, only the classified context surrounding it. With the agreement established, the documentary project entered a new phase. Over the next 3 weeks, the team expanded their scope, filming additional technical segments while pursuing contacts with Iraqi veterans who had operated T-62 tanks during Desert Storm. Through Lisa's connections, they located Fareed al-Jabouri, a former Iraqi Republican Guard officer who had commanded a T-62 company. Initially hesitant, al-Jabouri eventually agreed to be interviewed, traveling to Jordan where the production team met him at a hotel in Amman. Reynolds found himself face-to-face with a man who had once been his enemy, now a dignified civilian in his 60s. Their initial handshake was tentative, laden with the weight of their shared history as combatants on opposite sides of a conflict that had shaped both their lives. I never thought I would sit across from an American tank commander to discuss these events, al-Jabouri admitted through a translator. But perhaps it is time. 30 years is long enough to gain perspective. The interview that followed provided invaluable insights. Al-Jabouri described the experiences of Iraqi tank crews facing overwhelming American technological superiority. He explained how they had attempted to compensate for their disadvantages through tactics and positioning. We knew our T-62s could not match your Abrams in technology, he explained. So we relied on ambush positions, using terrain for concealment. But your thermal sights negated even this advantage. You could see us through dust and smoke that blinded our own gunners. When asked about the modified T-62, al-Jabouri became more guarded. There were rumors of special vehicles with enhanced protection systems, he acknowledged. But few of us ever saw them. They were reserved for special units with direct connections to Baghdad. As the interview progressed, Reynolds found himself developing an unexpected respect for his former adversary. Despite fighting for a regime he now acknowledged had been brutal and corrupt, al-Jabouri had been a professional soldier doing his duty as he understood it, just as Reynolds had. In the end, a tank is just steel, al-Jabouri reflected toward the conclusion of the interview. It is the men inside who determine its true capability, their training, their courage, their decisions under pressure. This is the same on all sides of any conflict. The sentiment resonated deeply with Reynolds, encapsulating what he had come to believe over his decades of service. The machines mattered. Their technical specifications and capabilities created advantages or disadvantages on the battlefield. But ultimately, war was a human endeavor shaped by human decisions, human courage, and human cost. Back in the United States, the documentary took its final shape. The technical analysis of Soviet and American tank design remained the foundation, but now within a richer context of personal experiences, tactical realities, and previously untold stories. Operation Dawn Runner was acknowledged publicly for the first time, described as a special mission to secure an advanced Iraqi tank with modified systems. Sergeant Marcus Wilson Sr.'s heroism in saving civilian lives was highlighted, with his son providing emotional narration over carefully selected photographs that showed the modified T-62 without revealing classified technical details. The Pentagon, true to the agreement, initiated a review of Wilson's service record. A corrected account of his death was entered into official documentation, and discussions began about a possible posthumous Silver Star to replace the Bronze Star he had received. As the documentary neared completion, Reynolds found himself in the editing room with Marcus, reviewing footage of the T-62's mobility demonstrations. "You know," Reynolds said, "your father would be proud of what you've accomplished here. Not just finding the truth about his death, but helping tell the whole story, the complex reality of what tank warfare really means." Marcus nodded, his expression reflective. "When I started this project, I wanted justice, recognition. I was angry about the secrets, the official story that sanitized his sacrifice. But now what?" Reynolds prompted when he trailed off. "Now I understand that the real story isn't just about classified missions or technology exchange programs," Marcus continued. "It's about people making difficult choices in impossible circumstances. My father choosing to save civilians, even at risk to himself. You choosing to preserve evidence but not expose it recklessly. The Iraqi commander choosing to do his duty despite overwhelming odds." Reynolds nodded, recognizing the wisdom the younger man had gained through this journey. "The machines matter," he agreed. "Their capabilities shape the battlefield. But in the end, it always comes down to human decisions." The documentary premiered 6 months later at a special screening at the National Armor Museum at Fort Benning. Military officials, veterans of Desert Storm, and families of those who had served and attended alongside media representatives and film industry figures. Reynolds sat in the front row, flanked by Thompson and Marcus. As the lights dimmed and the opening sequence began, he felt a sense of completion, of a circle closing after 30 years. The truth about Dawn Runner had emerged, not as a scandalous expose, but as part of a more nuanced understanding of modern warfare and the men who waged it. The film balanced technical analysis with human experience masterfully. The T-62's revolutionary design elements were explained in detail, from its hemispherical turret to its pioneering smoothbore gun. But these specifications were now contextualized within the experiences of those who had commanded these steel beasts in combat, both American and Iraqi. Operation Dawn Runner received its public acknowledgement, described as a mission to secure intelligence on advanced Iraqi armor capabilities. Sergeant Marcus Wilson Sr.'s actions, saving civilians under fire, were highlighted, with appropriate recognition of his sacrifice. When the screening concluded, the audience rose in standing ovation. For Reynolds, the applause represented not personal acclaim, but validation of a difficult choice, to bring long-hidden truth to light while still respecting the complex realities of national security. At the reception that followed, Reynolds found himself approached by Richard Blackwood, the Defense Department consultant who had initially opposed their project. "A remarkable achievement, Captain Reynolds," Blackwood acknowledged, gesturing toward the crowd discussing the film. "You managed to tell the truth without compromising security. A delicate balance few could have maintained." "The truth matters," Reynolds replied simply, "but so does understanding its context." "Indeed." Blackwood studied him thoughtfully. "You know, those photographs of yours, the ones you didn't include in the film, they should probably be properly secured in official archives now." Reynolds met his gaze steadily. "Some of them already are. The ones showing Sergeant Wilson's heroism, the modified T-62's exterior. The others remain my insurance policy, for now." Blackwood's expression flickered with concern, but he merely nodded. "Fair enough, though I hope you understand the responsibility they represent." "Better than most," Reynolds assured him. As Blackwood moved away, Marcus approached, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. He offered one to Reynolds. "To my father," he said, raising his glass, "and to the truth, complex as it may be." "To Sergeant Wilson," Reynolds agreed, "a hero by any measure." They drank, and Reynolds felt a weight lifting, A burden carried for 30 years finally shared and lightened. The photographs in his possession would likely never be needed again, but their existence had served their purpose, ensuring that at least some measure of truth emerged from the classified shadows of war. Later that evening, as the reception wound down, Reynolds found himself alone in the museum gallery, standing before the T-62 that had started this journey. Its curved turret and sloped hull gleamed under the display lighting, a silent testament to an era of conflict now passed into history. He placed his hand on the cold steel, feeling the connection to all it represented. Soviet engineering ingenuity, the calculus of protection versus mobility, the men who had fought and died inside similar machines in the Iraqi desert. And more personally, the mission that had cost Marcus Wilson Sr. his life while revealing secrets some had preferred to keep buried forever. Captain Reynolds? He turned to find Lisa Mitchell approaching, her documentary successfully launched. Her father's hope that the full story would someday be told now fulfilled. Quite a day, she said, joining him beside the tank. Indeed, Reynolds agreed. Your father would be proud of the film and of you. Lisa smiled. I think he knew someday I'd help bring this story to light. He always said there was more to what happened than the official record showed. There usually is, Reynolds acknowledged. War is never as clean or simple as the history books make it seem. What will you do now, Lisa asked, back to giving tours at the museum? Reynolds considered the question. The documentary project had reawakened something in him, a sense of purpose that retirement had dimmed. I think I have more stories to tell, he said finally, more truths to help uncover, not just about tanks or Desert Storm, but about what it really means to serve, to make impossible decisions, to carry the weight of command. Well, when you're ready to tell those stories, Lisa offered, you know who to call. As they walked together through the silent museum, past the steel sentinels of America's armored history, Reynolds reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From the battlefields of Iraq to the classified briefing rooms of the Pentagon to this moment of recognition and reconciliation. The T-62 had been the catalyst, its revolutionary design sparking a documentary that became much more than a technical analysis. It had become a vehicle for truth, for healing, for honoring sacrifices long obscured by official secrecy. In the end, Reynolds thought, that was perhaps the most important legacy of these machines of war. Not their firepower or their armor protection or their battlefield mobility, but their role in human history, in the stories of the men who designed them, operated them, fought against them, and sometimes died in them. Steel and fire, technology and tactics, these were the elements of tank warfare that could be measured and analyzed. But courage, sacrifice, duty, honor, these were the human elements that gave meaning to the cold calculations of combat effectiveness. As he left the museum that night, Reynolds carried with him not just the satisfaction of a mission finally completed, but the knowledge that some measure of justice had been done. The truth about Operation Dawn Runner had emerged into the light, and with it, proper recognition for a soldier's ultimate sacrifice. The legacy of steel, he reflected, was ultimately a legacy of the human spirit, forged in conflict but enduring in truth. And that, more than any technical specification or battlefield victory, was worth preserving for future generations to understand. Chapter 9, The Final Victory. 6 months after the documentary's premiere, Reynolds stood at attention beside Marcus Wilson Jr. on the parade ground at Fort Benning. Before them, a formation of soldiers in dress uniform created a backdrop of military precision for the small but significant ceremony about to take place. The occasion was the posthumous presentation of the Silver Star to Sergeant Marcus Wilson Sr., his heroism during Operation Dawn Runner finally receiving full recognition after 30 years. The award would be presented to his son, with Reynolds, Thompson, and other veterans of Desert Storm in attendance. Reynolds glanced at Marcus, noting how the young man had changed over the course of their journey together. The angry, suspicious filmmaker seeking justice for his father had matured into someone with a deeper understanding of military service, of the complex realities that shaped his father's sacrifice. The documentary project had given him not just answers about the past, but a new perspective on his own identity and purpose. Thompson stood nearby, having flown in from California specifically for the ceremony. The two old tank veterans had maintained closer contact since the documentary, reconnecting not just with each other, but with other members of their former unit, a brotherhood forged in steel and fire 3 decades earlier. A military band played as the ceremony began, the familiar rhythms of official recognition unfolding with practiced precision. The base commander spoke of duty and sacrifice, of actions above and beyond the call that defined the highest traditions of military service. Then it was Reynolds' turn to speak. He approached the podium, adjusting the microphone as he surveyed the assembled soldiers and civilians. Among them were several Pentagon officials, including Colonel Harrison, whose initial resistance to their documentary had eventually transformed into respectful collaboration. 30 years ago, Reynolds began, I had the honor of commanding Sergeant Marcus Wilson Sr. during Operation Desert Storm. Like many who served in that conflict, he performed his duty with courage and professionalism throughout the campaign. But it was during a mission after the official ceasefire that Sergeant Wilson demonstrated the kind of extraordinary heroism we recognize today. Reynolds recounted the circumstances of Operation Dawn Runner as they had been officially acknowledged, a special mission to secure intelligence on advanced Iraqi armor capabilities. He described how, when their tank came under unexpected fire, Wilson had spotted civilians caught in the crossfire. Without hesitation, Sergeant Wilson left the relative safety of our tank, Reynolds continued. In full view of enemy positions, he moved to assist these civilians, successfully guiding several children to shelter. It was while returning for additional civilians that he was mortally wounded by enemy fire. Reynolds paused, memories of that day still vivid after 3 decades. I ordered him to return to the tank. Those were my last words to him. His last words to me were, "Sir, there are still children out there." That was who Marcus Wilson was. A soldier who understood that our ultimate duty is not just to follow orders or complete missions, but to protect the innocent, even at the cost of our own lives. As Reynolds concluded his remarks, he saw Marcus blinking back tears, pride and grief mingling in his expression. The base commander stepped forward to present the Silver Star, reading the citation that officially recognized Wilson's heroism in terms that now matched the reality of his actions. Marcus accepted the medal with quiet dignity, then surprised everyone by asking to speak. He stepped to the podium, the Silver Star gleaming in its presentation box in his hands. I was 6 months old when my father died, he began. I grew up knowing him only through photographs and the stories my mother told. She always said he was a hero, but for most of my life, the official record contained only the barest acknowledgement of his service and sacrifice. Marcus glanced at Reynolds before continuing. It took 30 years and the courage of men like Captain Reynolds to bring the full truth to light, not just about my father's heroism, but about the complex realities of modern warfare, where the lines between peace and conflict, between official and unofficial actions, are not always clearly drawn. His words captured precisely what their documentary had ultimately been about. Not just the technical specifications of opposing tank designs, but the human dimension of armored warfare, the decisions made by flesh and blood men inside these steel machines. This medal, Marcus concluded, lifting the Silver Star, represents not just my father's courage, but the enduring importance of truth. Even when that truth is complicated, even when it takes decades to fully emerge, I accept it with pride and gratitude, both for his sacrifice and for those who never stopped working to ensure it would be properly recognized. The ceremony concluded with a rifle salute and the playing of taps, the haunting melody carrying across the parade ground as the flag was ceremonially folded and presented to Marcus alongside the medal. Reynolds stood at attention throughout, honoring not just Marcus Wilson Sr., but all those who had served under his command, whose lives had been entrusted to his decisions. Afterward, at a small reception in the officers' club, Reynolds found himself approached by a familiar figure. Richard Blackwood, the Department of Defense consultant who had initially opposed their documentary, offered his hand. A fitting ceremony, Blackwood observed. Sergeant Wilson deserved the recognition. Reynolds nodded, accepting the handshake. Better late than never. About those other photographs, Blackwood said, lowering his voice, the ones showing the specific components. Have you made a decision about their final disposition? Reynolds had been expecting this question. The documentary had been released to critical acclaim, the story of Operation Dawn Runner had been officially acknowledged, and Wilson's heroism had received proper recognition. The specific technical details of the modified T-62 remained classified, protected by the agreement they had reached. I have, Reynolds replied. They'll be secured in a way that ensures they'll only come to light if absolutely necessary. Insurance against any future attempts to rewrite this history. Blackwood studied him for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. Some secrets may need to remain secret, but their existence shouldn't be denied. The proper balance, I believe. As Blackwood moved away, Marcus approached, the silver star still in its presentation box in his hands. That's the guy from the Pentagon, isn't it? He asked quietly. Still worried about those photographs? Some people never stop worrying about secrets, Reynolds replied. It's their job. Marcus considered this. You know, when we started this project, I thought it was about exposing secrets, bringing everything into the light. Now I understand it's more complicated than that. Most things are, Reynolds agreed. The challenge is finding the right balance, honoring truth without causing unnecessary harm. Do you think we found that balance with the documentary, with today's ceremony? Reynolds looked around at the gathering, at Thompson sharing stories with younger officers, at Lisa Mitchell discussing future projects with her production team, at Colonel Harrison and his staff representing the official military acknowledgement of long classified events. I think we did, Reynolds said. Your father's heroism has been recognized. The reality of Operation Dawn Runner has been acknowledged. The specific technical details that might compromise current operations remain protected. A fair compromise. And the modified T-62, Marcus asked? The one that started all this? Whatever happened to it? Reynolds had wondered when this question would arise. Officially, it was destroyed in a processing error after the war. Unofficially, there are rumors it ended up in a secure facility somewhere, still being studied even now. Do you believe that? I believe some technologies are too valuable to destroy, even when they represent uncomfortable truths, Reynolds replied. Just like some stories are too important to remain untold, even when they complicate official narratives. Later that evening, as the reception concluded, Reynolds found himself alone with Thompson, the two old tankers sharing a quiet moment before parting ways again. Hell of a journey, Thompson remarked, sipping his bourbon. From Desert Storm to documentary subjects. Not where I thought we'd end up 30 years ago. Life rarely follows the expected route, Reynolds agreed. Like maneuvering a tank in combat. You have a plan, but you adapt to the terrain and the enemy as you encounter them. Thompson nodded. The kid turned out all right, Marcus. Reminds me of his father in some ways. He found what he needed, Reynolds said. Not just the truth about his father's death, but a connection to who his father was. That matters more than medals or official recognition. And you? Did you find what you needed? Reynolds considered the question. For 30 years, he had carried the weight of Dawn Runner, of Wilson's death, of secrets kept and truths obscured. The documentary project had forced him to confront that burden, to make difficult choices about loyalty, duty, and personal integrity. I found a measure of peace, he acknowledged. Not complete absolution, perhaps, but acceptance. We did our duty as we understood it, both during the war and afterward. Sometimes that meant following orders we didn't fully understand. Sometimes it meant making hard choices with limited information. And sometimes, like Sergeant Wilson, it meant following a higher calling, regardless of the consequences. The eternal tanker's dilemma, Thompson said thoughtfully. Balancing protection, mobility, and firepower. Only in life it's duty, conscience, and truth. Reynolds nodded, appreciating the apt analogy. Like tank designers throughout history, every soldier had to find their own balance between competing priorities, between organizational loyalty and personal integrity, between mission accomplishment and moral compass. As they parted ways that night, Reynolds felt a sense of completion that had eluded him since Desert Storm. The documentary had evolved from a technical analysis of Soviet tank design into something far more significant, an exploration of the human dimension of modern warfare, a reckoning with classified history, and ultimately a path to proper recognition for a fallen soldier. The T-62 that had sparked this journey remained on display at the National Armor Museum, its revolutionary design and historical significance now better understood by visitors who viewed it. But the modified T-62 from Operation Dawn Runner remained classified, its secrets still guarded, its legacy a complex intersection of technology, geopolitics, and individual courage. For Reynolds, that complexity was fitting. Tank warfare itself represented the same intersection, with engineering designs, tactical doctrines, and strategic considerations, all ultimately serving human purposes and subject to human decisions. The technical specifications mattered, but they were never the whole story. As he drove home that night, Reynolds thought about Marcus Wilson Jr., now carrying his father's Silver Star, and a more complete understanding of his sacrifice. He thought about Lisa Mitchell, who had started with a documentary about tank technology and ended with a powerful exploration of truth, secrecy, and the human cost of modern warfare. And he thought about his own journey from tank commander to reluctant keeper of secrets to catalyst for long overdue recognition. Some victories came quickly, measured in minutes on the battlefield, in enemy tanks destroyed and objectives secured. Others took decades, measured in truths acknowledged, sacrifices honored, and burdens finally set down. But in the end, Reynolds reflected, it was these longer, harder-fought victories that mattered most. The legacy of steel was ultimately a human legacy, forged in conflict, but enduring in truth. And that truth, complex and occasionally painful as it might be, was the final victory worth fighting for.